Hello, everybody. This is the second part of our open public education program. By open public education program means anybody can come at any point. Last week we talked about what is addiction. Today we're going to talk specifically about how drugs affect the brain in the first part, and we're going to talk about what the specific drugs are in the second part. So let's go back and do a little bit of review at first. We acknowledge that drugs are any substance other than food that changes the way the mind or the body functions. There are medical uses of drugs to combat pain or injury, to combat disease or infection, and to treat mental illness. Those are good examples of medical uses of drugs. There are also non-medical uses of drugs to alter mood, sensation, consciousness, or behavior, and spiritual or mystical explorations. My interest in drugs is historical and cross-cultural. By historical, I mean from the beginning of our human species. We have been using drugs. It's a very old behavior, nothing new about it. And every culture on the planet uses drugs, with one exception. The Inuit did not use drugs. They couldn't use drugs because alcohol did not ferment at that temperature, and there were no plants or animals that they could use to access drugs in their environment. So that's the only culture that hasn't used drugs. So it's a very, very old human behavior, and understanding it is important. And understanding why we as a human species spend so much attractions to drugs is part of what we're going to do here through this whole process. In fact, I find it interesting that the beginning of our human experience with drugs, if I look back into history from the beginning, and I look at why we use drugs and what we wrote about them, our early human experiences were largely about mystical and spiritual explorations, and some issues with pain management. That's the early stuff. Today, we use drugs for a whole bunch of different reasons in many different cultures for a whole variety of things. But I'm fascinated with our history. And our history comes from mystical or spiritual explorations. Now, we're going to talk largely about the physiology today. We're going to talk about our brains. And it's interesting, we're going to actually talk about the nervous system. Now, there are three kinds of nervous systems. There is our central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal column. There's our somatic nervous system, which is underneath our skin and allows us to feel stuff. And there's our autonomic nervous system that controls the beating of our heart. Now, drugs actually affect all three of those. And what is relevant in one becomes relevant in another, and why that's important will become clear in a moment or two. Now, if I reflect back on my high school experience, there was a science teacher who got up in front of me many years ago and defined the word homeostasis. And the word homeostasis was defined by this science teacher as balance. The body's attempt to achieve balance is constantly going on. And the process of homeostasis is what drives everything we're going to talk about. And we have thousands of different homeostatic mechanisms. How's that for a buzzword? For example, the size of your blood vessels under your skin change in response to heat and cold. When you are in cold environments, they shrink because you want to contain heat. You don't want to get rid of it. So your blood vessels become smaller and your skin becomes whiter when you get cold. When you're in hot environments, the blood vessels expand and they go redder on the surface is what you see because your body's trying to get rid of heat. So the body is constantly sensing and adjusting. And it adjusts based on this process of homeostasis, trying to achieve balance. And it's that process of sensing and adjusting that drives everything we're going to talk about. And there's a huge number of those processes in our body. The process of the color of our skin is only one of them. There's thousands of them. But the desire for the body to achieve balance drives the change that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about brains. We're going to talk about brain functioning. Now, when we as a human species started doing autopsies and dissecting dead bodies, we pulled out the heart and it made sense. It was a series of pumps. We pulled out the lungs and they made sense. They were bags of air and they kind of expanded and contracted. We kind of worked our way through the body and we understood one organ at a time, and then we pulled out the brain and it was a lump of jelly. and we couldn't understand it at all. In fact, somebody once said, if it was simple enough for us to understand it, we would be too simple to understand it. So it's taken us decades to try and understand this lump of jelly that we all have in our ears. Because really, it's only made of one cell, one kind of cell, which is a neuron. And there's billions of them. And how these neurons connect to other neurons is the change that we're going to talk about. So there's really two things. There's cells, the neuron, and then there's the chemicals that make the neurons work in a certain way. And the chemicals, the buzzword for the chemicals, is called neurotransmitter. Now, many of you have actually heard of different neurotransmitters. In fact, there's lots of them that you know about in a while. The first neurotransmitter that we probably all heard about, it is called adrenaline. Adrenaline pumps us up and gets us excited. Dopamine and serotonin are two neurotransmitters that are actually quite common. People do talk about them in our society. And they're profoundly related to addictions. And I'd like to explore why. Now, I like to be clear about my references and where I get my ideas from. And what I'm about to share with you was an idea I cooked up, and that I was at a social event, and I met a professor who studied neurotransmitters for a living. And I ran this idea by him, and he said to me, that sounds about right. So that's my reference for what I'm going to say. Dopamine and serotonin are fascinating neurochemicals, because serotonin is associated with feelings of elation and depression. When we're feeling completely miserable, we don't have much of the stuff. When we're happy and high and elated, we got lots of the stuff. But dopamine is different. Dopamine is associated with feelings of power and control and helplessness. If you reflect on your own human experience for a second, when you feel elated, you feel powerful. When you feel depressed, you feel powerless. But they're different human experiences. They go up and down together, but they are different. One is serotonin, one is dopamine. And it helps me to understand addictions, because I have somebody walking into my office and they say, you know, when I took this drug, it was fabulous. I was so high. That's elation. That's a good thing. We like that. But they also say to me, I became the person I always wanted to be. I had a sense of power and control in my life I never had before. That's dopamine. So drugs push up both dopamine and serotonin, and we like the experience because it works for us, because it gives us our basic human needs of power and control and elation. Endorphins are an interesting one. Now, I have a confession to make. I am an endorphin addict. What I do to get endorphins in my brain is I do the grouse grind. I run up that trail up the North Shore Mountain, 3,000 vertical feet, all the time. And when I come out of the top of that trail, I have a ton of endorphins in my brain and a huge smile on my face. So let's look at the word endorphin. We manufacture it in our brain with cardiovascular exercise. What is it? The root of the word endorphin is endogenous morphine. Ah, endogenous means the body's own. So we create our own morphine in our body when we exercise. Let's look at the word morphine for a second. The root of the word morphine is Morpheus. Now, Morpheus is not just a character in the movie Matrix. Morpheus was the god of dreaming. He was the son of Somnus, who is the god of sleeping. Ah, so we have our ability with cardiovascular exercise to create this drug in our brain that gives us this drifty, dreamy place that also is a great pain reliever. For the women in the room, the point in your life where you will have the most endorphin in your brain is not exercise, but giving birth to children. The process of giving birth to children is, I'm acutely aware, incredibly painful. And the body sees that and deals with it by pumping out this pain reliever in a huge level. And it usually takes a few days before that subsides and women sort of come back to dealing with the fact they've got this baby because of the amount of endorphin that's being pumped out for the process. Anandamide is an interesting one. It was discovered during cannabis research, and the root of the word anandamide is bliss. GABA is also a curious chemical because GABA is a neurotransmitter that controls people's behavior. And when we drink alcohol, GABA goes down, so people's behavior becomes less in control. One of the things that I do is I teach the police. And I talk to them about how they experience people's behavior, which they often see as being out of control. And they often comment to me that when people drink alcohol, they have a real tough time. The police have a tough time with them. And the reason why is their behavior is not so controlled. And then the police have to come in and exert control over these people who have less control. If you slice the human brain, let's say the dead human brain, this way, and you take a slice and you put it on the wall and you look at it, and you do that with the same thing with a dolphin, a whale, a chimpanzee, a squirrel, a lizard, and a worm, and you put them all together and you look at them, what you see are differences and similarities. The differences are between the dolphin, the whale, and the chimpanzee, and the human, and all the other species. Because what they have that the other species don't have is that curly outside part of the brain. What we see as similarities is the inside of the brain is identical with the dolphin, the brain, the chimpanzee, the squirrel, the lizard, and the worm. So what we have in the center of our brains is exactly the same as what a lizard has in their brain. When we're finished.
I didn't find the worm's brain.
I'll talk to you at the end.
All right.
Yes, hold on to your questions.
All right.
But the answer is with great difficulty. They're very small.
Pardon?
With great difficulty, they're very small.
Yeah,
They're very small. So what we see in the center of the human brain is exactly the same as what there is in a lizard's brain. So what's in the outside of the brain? The stuff that we share in common with dolphins, lizards, and chimpanzees. And the answer is what we share in common with those species is complex communication. Complex communication and the ability to be creative in completely new ways. So we can design buildings like this and computers like this, and we can go to the moon. What we share with all species is the center of the brain. And the center of the brain is responsible for the 4 F's. Fighting, feeding, fleeing, and mating. That was a joke. That was a joke. That was a joke. So essentially, the center of the brain is our survival stuff. So it's absolutely fascinating. If you take somebody that is addicted to a drug and you stimulate their addiction and you watch where the activity is in the brain, it's actually not in the outside of the brain, it's in the inside of the brain. Which helps me to understand when I have somebody in my office who is struggling with dealing with an addiction, and let's say her name is Mary. If Mary is sitting in my office and she's killing herself with this addiction, and I try to rationalize with her, I try to explain to her this is a bad idea, I'm appealing to the outside of her brain, and I'm not going to get very far. So if I am a skillful counselor, I will do more than just appeal to the outside of her brain. I will appeal to the inside of her brain. What does that mean? It means, yes, I will come up with lots of arguments why she should not do what she's doing. But I will also say to her, Mary, who do you connect with? Who can you talk to about this? Who can you get in your life that supports you around this? Because connection with fellow human beings is also in the center of the brain. We are hardwired to need each other. And we can use that to help us recover from addictions. So I would like to take a closer look at the neurons. They're a bit like octopuses. They have arms. They have a central body. And they have these long arms that reach out and almost, but not quite touch each other. They don't quite touch because there's a gap between where the arm goes out and the next cell starts. In fact, in that image that you see in front of you, there's a little square, a blue square, on the bottom left hand of the image. And that's the place where there's a gap between the arm and the next cell. That gap is where most of the research takes place. So I'm going to enlarge in the next image that gap, and it looks like this. The arm of the top is coming down, and it's almost but not quite touching the other cell. And all of those chemicals that we talked about are what flood into that space. The buzzword for that space is called a synapse. And that's where most research on brain chemistry looks at, because that's where the action is.
How much longer is it?
about 15 more minutes, maybe 20. So let's look at what happens when we take a whole bunch of drugs. Let's say cocaine, for example. Cocaine is a stimulant drug. If we flood that space with stimulant drugs, the body says, ouch, I now have too much stimulation. Remember we talked about balance, and the body's need to achieve balance. So what happens is the body reacts to the stimulation. Now, are you watching this image? I want you to take a really good close look at this because I'm about to show off my PowerPoint skills. Are you ready? The body says, ouch, and it withdraws the receptor sites. The analogy is a lock and a key. These chemicals are like keys, and they float across to the locks on the other side, and they stimulate them. And when there is too much stimulation, the locks withdraw. I have just shown you an image of depression. If we take a lot of stimulant drugs, our body acts in the opposite direction, and we become depressed. So whatever we're trying to achieve, the brain forces us to get the opposite effect. If we want to achieve a sense of power and control in our lives, the brain gives us a sense of powerlessness because it gets flooded with too many chemicals and it changes how it works. Now the good news is, watch this. Are you watching this image? The good news is the brain can heal itself. The depression will lift. If we just hang out long enough and allow the brain to do its healing, it is not permanent. And it's not just brains that change, but hey, bodies change too. If you ever notice somebody that's half horse and half human being clopping down the street, sorry, son, but for you to understand what happened, you first have to understand back in the 60s, we were all taking a whole lot of drugs.
That's true.
We turned into a whole different creature. That's just a joke.
Or tranquilizer. But are we able to dream again?
Yes.
Or tranquilizer.
Yes. So I want to talk about the language that we use to describe this. We use the language of tolerance. By that I mean it takes more to get the same effect. Whenever we take a drug, it stops responding. We stop responding to it. So we take more, and we stop responding, and we take more, and we stop responding when we take more. And then we have the process of withdrawal, and that's the opposite. Whatever drug we took, we get the opposite experience. If we take stimulant drugs, we wind up feeling depressed. In fact, it doesn't matter what drug you name. If you chase the main effect of the drug, you will then know what the withdrawal is. Let's look at heroin for a second. The main effect of heroin is to sedate us, to slow us down, to relieve pain, and it dries us out. It's a constipator. It dries us from the nose to the gut. So the opposite effect of heroin is exactly the opposite of that. The withdrawal effect is the opposite. So it stimulates pain, it stimulates agitation, and it wettens us. So we have a drippy nose, and quite frankly, we're in the toilet a whole lot. That's the way it works. So whatever a drug is, the withdrawal effect will be the opposite, and our brain won't let us do it any other way. It's just the way we're wired, and it's our desire to achieve balance. So what I've said so far is, when we use drugs, there are short-term changes in how those synapses, those gaps work. We also develop tolerance. It takes more to get the same effect. Sometimes drugs actually damage or destroy cells. Now, most drugs don't kill brain cells. That was the old model of drug education, where we used to tell people stuff that was not true in order to make them afraid. I don't do that anymore. I only talk about what actually is true. And some drugs kill brain cells. The classic example of a drug that is actually damaging to a brain is alcohol.
Alcohol?
Alcohol.
Alcohol is like a drug.
Alcohol is a drug. If alcohol was invented today, it would only be available on prescription. Now, I don't buy the model of hard drug or soft drug, but if I did, if there was such a thing as a hard drug or a soft drug, alcohol would be a hard drug. Alcohol is a relatively nasty drug to the human body, and we'll talk about why that is after the break. So there is damage or destruction of cells, but specifically alcohol tends to be the worst. There is also the process of delayed development. Anybody that works in the addiction services has people showing up in their offices with 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-year-old bodies, and often they behave like they're teenagers. They're still fighting it out in the playground. Now, I do not know exactly why that is, but I have a theory, and I'd like to share it with you. My theory is this. None of us want to grow up. We don't. It's so nice not growing up. And one of the things that I have said is addiction is an attachment disorder. And that particular statement will echo through all of my talks. So one of the reasons why we grow up is because we are connected to other people, and they force us to grow up by saying, I don't think that's a good idea.
You can't do this.
Yes, exactly.
That's not do.
Yes.
You say you can't. You
And so therefore, we stay young. When we're in the place of addiction, we just stay young. Also, for the women in the room, there is one drug that is particularly damaging to fetuses, babies inside women. What drug is that? Alcohol. Yes. Alcohol is obnoxious for women to drink when they're pregnant. So, last week, I talked about how the main drivers to addiction is not drugs. The main driver to addiction is our humanity. And the reason why we are attracted to drugs is a whole lot of different reasons. While that's true, I'd like to kind of make it a little more subtle by observing that there are different addictive elements to drugs. And there's really two factors here. One is how we take a drug, and the other is the drug itself. So there's 4 different ways of taking a drug. There's inhaling, injecting, snorting, and swallowing. And as at the top of this graph is more addictive, and the bottom of this graph is less addictive. Let's look at cocaine, for example. When we smoke crack cocaine, we tend to have an addictive relationship with it. On the other end of that spectrum is a weak oral solution of cocaine drinking in coca tea, which tends to produce no addictions at all. So the Aboriginal people in South America who have been drinking coca tea have no problems with exactly the same drug. So the more purified and the more concentrated the drug, and the more rapidly we ingest it, the more problems we have with the drug. In a minute. Almost finished, and we'll have lots of chance for discussion. So while one factor that drives addiction is how we take it, and the more purified and the more rapidly we take it, the greater problems we have. And the other driver to addiction is the drug itself. Now, this particular slide is of a rank order of different drugs in terms of their addictiveness. Now, how this particular piece of research was done was many people, thousands of people were asked, have you ever taken the drug? And if they say yes, the next question is, can you stop taking it now? And the more people that say yes to the second question, the higher it is in the pile. So it's interesting to look at this list. Tobacco is the most addictive drug on the planet. It's followed by crack cocaine or crystal meth, followed by smoking or injecting heroin, followed by injecting methamphetamines, followed by snorting cocaine, followed by eating amphetamines, followed by ingesting sedative hypnotics, followed by drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, drinking caffeine, eating the psychedelics, and then the psychedelics that make you vomit. Now, I added psilocybin to this because I did have a piece of research that said it was the least addictive drug, and he made a compelling case. So I've taken 2 studies and combined them with this particular slide.
Caffeine's a drug?
Caffeine is a drug. It's a liquid stimulant drug, and it's a very popular drug in our society.
Caffeine?
Caffeine is a drug.
What?
Caffeine
No
is a
wonder
drug.
I'm so addicted to pop.
And in fact, it has a withdrawal. It's called headaches.
Is it?
Yes.
How come I
It
never
is.
get headaches?
Maybe you're drinking it consistently.
What does that mean?
Hang on a
If I
second.
don't take the
We're
drink?
almost finished. We're almost finished, guys. We are almost finished.
Okay.
Almost done.
Okay.
We've got about 3 more minutes, guys. So, what I've said so far is, we developed this process of addiction that has the elements of tolerance and withdrawal. So it's interesting to look at what happens if we don't take a drug for a long period of time. As we start taking it again, there's a couple of factors to consider. One is being addicted to a drug is a bit like riding a bicycle. So if it took us 10 years to get addicted the first time, it'll take us 10 minutes or 10 hours or whatever. It'll be a very, very brief process that we have. It's not going to take us 10 years the second time. It's going to be virtually immediately. While that's true, we also will not have tolerance. By that I mean if we have not taken a drug for a long time, we do lose tolerance to it. So it has a big effect on us initially, but we have an explosive addiction that happens very, very quickly. This is my clue that we're halfway through. It's not a nicotine patch. It's a CD-ROM. I'm trying to overcome computer addiction. If we were going to try and understand the substances, drugs, and the kind of categories, and we wanted to put them into piles that make them make sense, there's many ways that we could pile them. We could put them into plant-based drugs and non-plant-based drugs. There's many ways of dividing them down to understand them, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use 4 different piles. I'm going to talk about uppers, stimulants. I'm going to talk about downers, which are depressants. I'm going to talk about the psychedelics, and I'm going to talk about cannabis. And cannabis doesn't fit in any of the other classifications. It really does deserve a pile by itself because it is unique. It's really different, and it doesn't really fit anywhere else. So we're going to have 4 piles. We're going to have uppers, downers, psychedelics, and cannabis. So let's start by talking about the uppers, which are the stimulant drugs. Examples of the stimulant drugs are, we've talked about it already, caffeine is an example. So is crystal meth, so is cocaine. Those are all stimulant drugs. They give us energy, they keep us awake. Stimulant drugs fit quite well together as a classification here. While their owners sleep, nervous little dogs prepare for their day by drinking espresso. If you're going to bark all day long, you probably want to have some caffeine on board, because that's what nervous little dogs need to just keep on going. So if you look at stimulant drugs, they tend to fit well together as a group. Now that's kind of an interesting thing to say. So really what I've said is there isn't that much difference between all of them. So if you take enough cocaine, you'll go completely crazy. It will drive you nuts. It creates psychosis in somebody. But you know something? That's also true for caffeine. If you drink enough caffeine, you will have some really big problems being sane, because stimulant drugs will drive anybody crazy. If you take enough of them, we as a human species have a really big problem on our hands. And what we said before is because the process of trying to achieve balance is always going on in our bodies, if we take enough stimulant drugs, we will become depressed. So actually, what it looks like in a person who uses a lot of stimulant drugs is often they will take a lot of stimulant drugs and stay awake for a few days. And then they will crash and go to sleep. And they will sleep for a very long length of time. Now, when they were awake, they were not eating very much. It also reduces appetite. So what we've learned about drugs so far is whenever we take a drug, the withdrawal is the opposite of the drug. So the main effect of stimulant drugs is wakefulness and no eating. So the withdrawal effect is sleeping, waking up, going and eating, and going back to sleep. So you can walk into a detox center and look around the room and tell within about 30 seconds who's withdrawing from which drugs. Because the folks that are sleeping or eating a lot in the kitchen are the people who've come in there for stimulant drugs. Now, one of the things that I offered when I was talking about drugs last week, I talked about my process with you guys. And we used to do drug education by trying to get people afraid of drugs. And we would exaggerate the harms of drugs, and we'd never talk about the benefits of drugs. And I offered you a different process here. I offered you honest drug education. If I'm going to do honest drug education with you, I have to acknowledge the benefits of drugs and the harms of drugs, and I need to do it in some kind of balance. So with all drugs, I will talk about both benefits and harms. Because the benefits of stimulant drugs are they give us energy, and they can allow us to control our weight to some extent. And we have feelings of euphoria and power and control in our lives when we take them. The potential harms of these drugs is we can become completely dependent on them, because we get so miserable and depressed when we stop taking them. We can also, if we take too much of them, become very psychotic. We will become very, very crazy if we take too much of these drugs. And it can have health, financial, relationship, employment, or school impacts because of our drug use. Now, depressant drugs don't fit so well together because they're a little different from each other. So really, I'm going to subdivide the depressant classification into the opiates and then the everything else category. Example of the opiates are opium, codeine, morphine, heroin, methadone, Demerol, Percodan, and OxyContin. So if you look at the opiate drugs, all of those ones I just mentioned really only vary in three ways. They vary in strength of action, length of action, and stickiness. Remember we talked about the lock and the key. The lock floats across the key, across the synaptic gap into the lock. The key floats across into the lock. Did I say that right? And there's an attraction between the two. So opiates vary in the amount of stickiness. So that's very useful for ambulance drivers to know. If somebody is overdosing on heroin in the downtown east side, what an ambulance driver will do is give somebody a shot of Narcan. So let's look at what happens in that person's body when that occurs. Because heroin is not very sticky. And Narcan is really sticky. And Narcan is a weak, medium length of action opiate. So if we have taken too much heroin and we are dying, and an ambulance driver gives us Narcan, it's stickier than heroin, so it kicks all the heroin out of our brains, and it substitutes it with a much weaker opiate. Just, it happens to be a highly sticky opiate. So ambulance drivers have a problem. And the problem is somebody whose lives they have just saved will wake up, and they'll be really angry. Now, the reason why they're really angry is because Narcan is a weak opiate. It's not strong enough to overcome the withdrawals. So somebody will take heroin, they'll go into this drifty, dreamy, wonderful experience, and they'll spend a lot of money to get there, and they'll be dying, and then they'll have their life saved by the ambulance driver, and what they experience is, you've taken away my high, I'm really in withdrawal right now, I'm really sick, how dare you do that? So ambulance drivers save people's lives, and instead of saying, hey, thanks, I appreciate that, what they get is angry people. And that's exactly why. And it happens all the time in this city. Now, methadone is a long-acting, sticky opiate. So we will give methadone to heroin people who have been using heroin for a long time, because you only have to use it once a day. And heroin has to be used 3 or 4 times a day. So it's a longer-acting, stickier drug. And that's why we give it, so people don't go into withdrawals if they're taking it once a day.
You said off of it, that's what they use, methadone.
Hang on to your thoughts, and I'll share them with you in about 15 minutes. So the other classification, the other type of sedative drug is kind of everything else, which are the alcohol, barbiturates, Cerex, Ativan, Xanax, Valium, lorazepam, GHB, and ketamine. But I'd like to talk about 2 in that group. I'd like to talk about alcohol first. Alcohol is an interesting drug, and alcohol is a drug. It happens to be a liquid sedative drug, and our society tells us it's not a drug, it's a drug. What kind of drug it is kind of interesting, because it's a general depressant. And what do I mean by that? It means it doesn't selectively depress anything. Heroin selectively depresses pain and the gut functioning, so it slows the gut down and dries it out. So that's what heroin does. Alcohol sedates everything. It sedates consciousness at the same speed that it sedates pain. So in the old cowboy movies, when the dentist, who was also the doctor, who was also the guy that shod your shoes, and also the guy that sold you gunpowder, was fixing your dental problem, which means grabbing the tooth with a pair of pliers and ripping it out, what he would do is he would sedate you with alcohol. That was the local anesthetic of the day. The point at which the consciousness was sedated was the same at which pain was sedated.
Well, laudanum.
Well, you're right. It would have been better. Laudanum is an opiate, and it would have been much better. Because alcohol is a lousy pain reliever. Because it's general, and it sedates consciousness at the same rate that it sedates pain. As opposed to the opiates that sedate pain first and consciousness second. So, given that theory, that different sedatives sedate different things, it's interesting to look at Valium. Valium, Ativan, Cerex, clorazepam, lorazepam, anything ending in PAM, are a benzodiazepine. Now, the benzodiazepines are given for 2 reasons. They're prescribed for 2 reasons. One is to reduce anxiety, and the other is to help people sleep. Now, so what do they sedate? Specifically, they sedate feelings, and they help people to sleep. So the opposite of that is increasing agitation and insomnia. So when we run a detox center, the folks that are the most difficult people to manage are the people who are withdrawing from the benzodiazepines, because what they have is high levels of intense anxiety, and they can't sleep because the drug is stimulating them. So benzodiazepines are a fairly tough drug to withdraw from because of the element of anxiety that's associated with them. So really, I've talked about the opiates, I've talked about the benzos, and I've talked about alcohol. What's interesting about the opiate drugs, heroin being an example, is they don't hurt the body at all. There's nothing damaging physically about opiate drugs. Now, admittedly, if people take street heroin, they don't know what they're taking, and some of that other stuff will cause harm. But pure opiate drugs are not harmful to the body. And by that I mean you can take it every day of your life, and you won't shorten your life expectancy so long as you don't take too much and it kills you. So given that, if you're taking a known dosage of a known purity, you're fine, other than the fact that perhaps being constipated, but you're not damaged from the experience. The alcohol damages pretty well every organ in your body. And certainly if you drink enough of it, it will destroy your liver and you will die of a liver failure. So alcohol is a relatively harmful drug on the scale of drugs. And the benzos, while they don't hurt you, create agitation in people when you stop taking them. So with all drugs, there are benefits and there are harms. So the potential benefits of depressant drugs are reduction of physical and emotional pain. That's a good thing. And there can be some health benefits. Small amounts of alcohol can help reduce blood pressure, which is a good thing for men with high blood pressure or women with high blood pressure. And people feel connected to other people when they're taking alcohol. Connections with others are a good thing. We need connections, and anything that we can find a way of connecting with each other helps. The potential problems with depressants are dependency. If we can't stop taking it, we have a problem. If we take too much of it and then we die, we have a big problem on our hands. And one of the problems that I do like to talk about is date rape, because people will give somebody else a sedative drug so they can have sex with them. That is a problem. So I have a suggestion to the women in the room. If you are in a social event and you are drinking alcohol and you leave your drink unattended and there's anybody in the room you don't know or you don't trust, throw it away if you go to the washroom when you come back. Get a new drink. Make sure you watch the person opening your drink and you make sure you pour your own. Date rape is a problem that I like to raise awareness about. There can also be health, economic, social, work, or school problems associated if we can't stop taking these drugs. I would also like to talk about the psychedelics, an example being mushrooms. Did you see that? This is PowerPoint at its best. So the hallucinogens, psychedelics, or changers, are a very old drug. They've been used from the beginning of time, and some of the oldest written history that we have about drugs are commenting on these. They tend to not be addictive. I've been working in this field for close to 30 years now, and nobody has ever walked in my office saying, I can't stop taking LSD. And the reason why they're not addictive is because people develop really, really rapid tolerance to it. So on the second or the third day, they just stop working, and there's no point in taking them. So people don't tend to keep taking them. And essentially, most people stop taking them because they become afraid. It's just kind of a scary place that people go to. The most common reason that youth tell us they use these is because they are fun. But they're also spiritual. They've been used for Aboriginal communities for centuries now. It's a very old experience that we as a human culture have. And they are also used in therapy. And they've been used in therapy for about 30 years now. And there's quite a bit of literature on that. The different experiences people have on these drugs tend to be related to two factors. One is set and one is setting. Set is the expectation, and the setting is the circumstances of use. And we can kind of predict whether somebody's going to have a wonderful or a horrible experience if you look at the set and the setting of the experience. Examples are mescaline, peyote, psilocybin, DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine, PCP, DXM, MDMA, MDA, LSD. And if I really think about the problems that people have with these, it really often comes down to lack of supervision. And if I think about any Aboriginal group that uses these substances and they use them with wisdom in context of their culture, people are highly supervised when they're using it. When I look at ayahuasca ceremonies or peyote ceremonies, they're structured environments where the elders of the community guide a process that binds people to their culture. It's interesting to look at the words that we have used to describe these substances over the last 40 years. When they were first discovered by North Americans, the word used to describe them was psychomimetic. And it was believed that by psychiatrists that they could help understand mental illness. And so the word psychomimetic means mimicking of mental illness. And then the 60s came along, and the word used to describe them was hallucinogen, because people see stuff when they're on them. And then somebody said, well, there's a lot more going on. People understand their minds in a certain way. So psychedelic was the word that was used, which means manifesting of the mind. And then somebody else came along and said, but we need to understand that these are old chemicals that have been used in Aboriginal communities for centuries. So let's use the word entheogen, which means manifesting of the spirit. And then somebody else came along and said, but really it's about connection with others. And when these chemicals are used in groups, they're often highly empathic of each other. People get very connected to each other. So the word empathogen was used to describe it. So when you look at these 5 words, what you see is these are complicated. These are not simple experiences. There's a lot of complexity here, and it changes over time. With all drugs, there are potential harms and potential benefits. So the potential benefits are insight, often in psychotherapeutic conditions, mystical or spiritual explorations, absolutely, and connection to a specific culture or group. And healing for addictions is something that I'm very interested in. Specifically, a drug called ibogaine seems to be very helpful when it comes to healing for addictions. The potential harms are fear of loss of control, and anything that makes people feel that they're out of control. It comes down to expectations and the environment. There's some really bad environments to do these things in. If somebody takes one of these drugs and goes out and drives a car, they're going to have a bad experience. That is, by definition, a problem. And there is some discussion about whether these drugs can trigger psychosis. But the truth of the matter is there's a lot more discussion about the triggering of psychosis with cannabis. So the last drug I'd like to talk about is our most popular drug in our city, but it's also a really complicated drug. Cannabis is not simple. There's nothing simple about it. In fact, it's so complicated it deserves a classification by itself. So I'd like to talk about it because it doesn't really fit any of the other classifications, partly because if you talk to somebody who's smoking cannabis and you ask them how they feel, they'll often say, well, I feel really relaxed. But if you put a heart rate monitor on them, what you'll see is they have higher heart rate. So they have a stimulant effect, they have a relaxed effect, and if we take enough of them, it starts to behave a bit like a psychedelic. One of the unique features of cannabis is how it works in the body. It is fat soluble, it is not water soluble. It gets soaked up into the fat of the body, not the water. And with our water of our body, we excrete it all the time. It's called drinking liquid and peeing it out. And that process of filtering water our body does all the time. And most drugs kind of become part of that water process. Cannabis doesn't. It becomes part of our fat process, which is different. We eat food, it gets turned into fat in our bodies, and then we burn it for energy to keep our heart rate going. That's how we work with fat. Fat is fuel. Starts out as food, goes into fat, and becomes fuel for our bodies. Cannabis goes into the fat system of the body. So it hangs around. You can pee test somebody with cannabis, and you'll see that they smoked it a month before. There's no other drug like that. You can't see it in the urine a month later. All other drugs get filtered out of your body. Cannabis doesn't. It sticks around.
Good for cancer.
Hang on a second. I'm going to answer that question. So while people don't tend to have dependent relationships with cannabis, some people do. And how do I know that's true? Is because they come and talk to me. And what they say is, I can't stop smoking this stuff. So there is a population that becomes dependent on them. I'm aware of them because they have conversations with me. But I admit, it's not the same as crack cocaine. It is not the same kind of dependency. Now, the second bullet down here, connecting marijuana or cannabis to cancer, is controversial. Now, why? This is the only bullet in all of these 12 hours of presentations that I do where I do not know what the relationship is. And the reason why is I have a stack of research. Some of the research says if you smoke cannabis, cannabis rates go up. Some of the research says if you smoke cannabis, cancer rates go down. And some of the research says it doesn't make any difference. So I do not know what the relationship between cannabis and cancer is. And I can show you studies that give you completely contradictory evidence. And so I cannot explain what the relationship between cannabis and cancer is. And I'm waiting for somebody to come along and look at all that research. Hang on a second. I'm waiting for somebody to come along and explain it to me. We'll have this discussion in a moment. There are also pregnancy complications. Women who smoke a lot of it can give birth to low birth weight babies. Now, they're not damaged babies in the same way that alcohol damages babies. But if it's low birth weight, I think it's a concern. So I think generally it's better if women don't smoke cannabis when they're pregnant. Now, with all drugs, there are potential benefits and there are potential harms. So let's look at the benefits of cannabis. If we smoke it and it reduces our nausea and our pain, and we're in chronic pain and we're not taking other drugs that are worse for us, or we start to eat, that's a good thing, especially if we're taking AIDS medication and we're losing weight. So if it stimulates our appetite when we need it, that's a good thing. People who smoke it tend to be very connected to other people in the room. That's a good thing. Social connections are important. And people say they smoke it because it's relaxing and it's fun and they get high. Those are all good things. The potential harms of cannabis are it tends to slow down our ability to memorize stuff. So we have memory problems as a result. And most people stop smoking it because it creates anxiety. If somebody sits in my office and they say, I don't smoke that stuff, I used to smoke it, I can't stand it anymore, I'll say, why? What happened? And what they will say to me is, well, I just became paranoid. But if I really chase that, it isn't paranoia. What it is anxiety. So eventually when people smoke enough cannabis, they tend to not smoke it anymore because they don't like the experience anymore. And if we eat it, we can have panic attacks just because we feel completely out of control. And those can actually last for a while. There's quite a bit of discussion about the relationship between cannabis and psychosis. It's a very small population, but researchers keep chasing that question. And it seems like it certainly can make mental health problems worse. But there's a big discussion about its exact role with that. Now, I've question marked the issue of lung problems because what I said is I don't really know the relationship between cannabis and cancer, but I also observe other things go wrong with lungs other than cancer, things like emphysema. And whether it's a fireman running into a burning building or somebody smoking cigarettes or somebody smoking cannabis, particulate matter in the lungs don't like stuff in them, and it's stuff in the lungs. So generally speaking, things in the lungs are not good for lungs. Now, this graph is complicated, but I'd like to observe that there's a whole lot of stuff in here. In this graph, it looks at dependence, withdrawal, tolerance, reinforcement, physical harm, and intoxication. And really what I get out of this graph is all drugs are different. They're quite different. And we tend to talk about drugs as though they were all the same. And the truth of the matter is they're not. They're all completely different.